Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in Salesforce Ethics Hour. My name is Amit Chaudhary. I'm your co-founder and the host. And today we are going to talk about the two critical part of the CTA exam, data and the security. And we have a CTA speaker, Calvin, with us. So let me hand over him for his introduction and the presentation.
Yeah.
Calvin,
So
hand over
thank you
to
so
you.
much. Yeah, thank you so much, Amit. First of all, warm welcome to all of you for joining my session, and thank you all for joining. And my name is Calvin Norona, as Amit mentioned, and I'm a senior program architect at Salesforce. So today I'll be talking about two of these sections, which is data and security. And before I just proceed further, just want to say once again, thank you for Amit and Apex House for having me. I just want to say that when I was preparing for my CTA as a candidate, I really found a lot of the videos that you shared here very useful. So I feel it's a privilege for me to be on Apex House and sharing my knowledge now with other folks who are looking to be on that same journey. So thank you guys once again. Okay, so with that, I'll just briefly talk about the agenda for today. So I'll first give a brief introduction of myself, and then we'll do a quick high-level review of these two sections and why are they important in the CTA from my perspective. And then we'll do a little bit of a deep dive on each of the sections, sorry. And the first section is obviously data, and as you know, the three things there is mainly the data model. So looking at what is important around formulating a data model as part of your solution. Then also it is around data migration and what should be considered for that. And also, how do you identify and manage large data volumes or LDV around data? Then, as part of security, again, how do you secure your Salesforce data, which is the prime objective? And then, what are some of the key platform security capabilities that we need to keep in mind? And identity and access management, which is all about SSO and OAuth, right? So all of that also comes under the security domain. So we look at that and also close it out with some other additional topics in the security section. Now, one thing to point out obviously is data and security. These are very vast and broad topics, right? So it's very hard to give a detailed coverage of these topics in a 1 hour session, but that's why I've kept this a more simpler high level view, and also it'll focus more mainly on some tips, strategies, and also some of the lessons that I've learned from my personal journey in the CTA. And then obviously I'll do a quick summary, and then I will leave time for Q&A. So because I have around 28-30 slides to cover, I would request that we keep questions till the end, if that makes sense. And then I can close out the questions, and also I'm happy to follow up with any questions offline also if needed. Okay, so with that being said about the agenda, let me also, one quick reminder is that even though I'm a Salesforce employee, today I'll be presenting this in my individual capacity. Okay, so quickly about me, I'm a Salesforce CTA. So I got my CTA in July last year, and I'm working as a senior program architect at Salesforce. And it's been close to 4 years now. So this April, it'll be 4 years of work here at Salesforce, which is still unbelievable to me. And previously, I was a part of the partner ecosystem, very much part of it. And my last role was a technical team manager and architect at IBM here in Melbourne. And currently, the CTA was my 18th certification, and I hope that won't be my last. And also, I have a master's degree in computer science. So one of the subjects that I mastered in was, majored in was database systems. And interestingly, I'm talking about data as part of this today as well. So previously, I've spoken about one topic at Dreamforce and Tailhead DX, and that topic was a very basic introduction to OAuth. And I'll cover a little bit about that later on in the session. So as I said, I live in Melbourne, Australia. It's 1 a.m. and it's already Sunday for me today here. And basically, I live with my wife and two cats, and you'll see a bit of them throughout this session. So basically, Ada is the brown Burmese cat, and then Freddie is the ginger cat. And so these help a lot with my stress relief, and I feel pretty happy being with them. And also, in terms of my key experiences, I've worked in 4 major industry verticals. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because, as you know, your CTA scenario, it's based on one vertical, right? So for example, you could get a scenario on finance, or a scenario on banking or on vehicles or something, right? So I worked in telco, public sector, healthcare, and higher ed. So the thing is, if you're lucky enough, you may get a domain in the scenario which you are comfortable with or which you know. But even if you don't get it, right, because it's not easy, it's not possible for every person to work on all these things, because there are infinite number of verticals almost, right? But then you need to fall back on your experience, on your knowledge, your basics, and then there are enough clues in the scenario itself which will help you to solve the requirements, right? So you don't have to worry too much about not having knowledge in a particular domain. And I'll talk more about that later on in this presentation. Okay, so with that, let's move on. So before we start, just a few things I wanted to remind everyone about. So first of all, what I'm going to talk about are my personal opinions and advice, which are based on my experiences, right? So the thing is, all of us look at things differently, and what may work for me may not work for you. So my advice is always listen to different folks talking about their opinions, and then form your own opinions which work for you. Do your own research, and then create your own path. You can be a trailblazer, and you can create some stuff which makes sense to you in terms of your study and in terms of preparation. And also, as you know, as I said previously, data and security are very vast domains. So that's why I've kept things simple in this presentation, and I'm focusing mainly on the different thought processes, some tips and strategies, and some lessons learned from my experience with the CTA journey. And as many others have told you, it is not just about giving a right answer as part of your solution, but you should also accompany that answer with the right justifications. And also you should be able to openly clarify any assumptions that you have, right? So you need to communicate these things clearly to the judges when you're presenting your solutions. I've also made every attempt to adhere to the Salesforce credential and certification program agreement, which basically means that I'm not sharing any secrets as such from my experience, but all of this is generally available information. And some of it is also my experience with my preparation. And one quick shout out for Georgi, my fellow CTA and fellow, he also works at Salesforce basically, and he did a quick review of the content. So thank you so much. And I believe he's also on this, has joined us for the session here. So thanks, Georgi. Okay, so with that, basically, let's look at what these two fundamental sections are in the CTA and why I consider them to be important. So first of all, the CTA has around 7 sections, right? And I believe that all of them are equally important. That means you need to get a passing score in all of them to basically pass your CTA. And even the 7th section, which is communication, is pretty important. We saw that recent session in Apex Stars from Lilith, which basically stress on the importance of communication, right? So every section is important. But in my experience, I've seen that the chances of doing well in the CTA is always boosted by doing well in data and security. Because if you think about it, data and security basically encompass all the other sections in the CTA. And we need to recognize that all the requirements in the CTA, right? There is a coherent, logical fashion that basically needs to come together in your solution. So all of these requirements are interlinked. And we need to identify and understand that they are interlinked and they are interrelated, and that's why they all come together, and they need to come together in our solution when we are solving it and when we are presenting it back to the judges. And so when it comes to data, right, so we need to understand that data is just not a static element. It basically has a life cycle. Someone is creating it, someone is working with it, and then something happens to it maybe, and it could also get archived, right? So there's a whole life cycle for the data. And similarly, you also need to demonstrate to the judges that you can secure the data and not just the data, but the solution as a whole, right? In general, you can secure the whole thing. So that is why data and security are pretty important. And that's why I'm trying to emphasize, the importance that if we focus our preparation strategy on these 2 sections firstly and foremostly, the other CTA sections will basically stack on top of this, and all of those different parts of the puzzle will come together in a nice way. And at least that has been my experience, at least. The other thing is, the other reason I stress on data and security is that this is my whole journey to the CTA, which I won't cover now. But suffice to say, when I joined Salesforce almost 4 years ago, I was focused on my work and stuff, but we have our own internal CTA training. And in May 2020, I qualified for it, and then we had quite a journey of actually preparing for the CTA. And I was lucky enough to have a coach, Jerry Huang, who also works at Salesforce. He was my coach, and basically, as part of this journey, I was able to qualify for and attempt my CTA in November 2020. So I got a partial pass in my first attempt, and I had to do a retake on data and security. And I feel that there were some fundamental mistakes I made, and how these mistakes cascade. That was my experience, and I felt that there were some small things that I missed out on, and those basically resulted in getting missing some requirements in these sections. So then I took a break, and then maybe in April and May of 2021 this year, I again picked up the pieces of the CTA where I left it, and I started studying data and security again from the ground up. I basically assumed that I don't know these sections, and I started studying them from the ground up, and that's how I was able to take the retake after a couple of months, and then I got my CTA in July 2021. And that's why again that experience basically again stressed the importance of these sections. I was like, if in hindsight, these sections are where typically candidates and even myself had a bit of a struggle, and if we could focus well on them, then our CTA journey would probably become more easier. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into our first section, which is data, right? So again, so as CTA candidates, you obviously need to be reviewing the CTA exam guide, right, from time to time. And if you look at the data section, right, so basically there are three things, as I mentioned. The first thing is whether you can identify large data volumes, and are you able to mitigate and optimize the solution to handle these volumes. The second thing, which is innocently described, is about data modeling concepts, right? But this bullet point here, for me, this is the most important bit of the CTA, in my opinion. And I'll talk about why that's the case. And the next thing, as we saw, is we need to also solve the data migration, come up with the strategy, considerations, tools, plans, so on and so forth. So let's look at some of what things are made up in as part of solving this section. So again, as I said, solving this is not important, but telling why, right? Justifying your answer is equally important as well. So why is the data model so important? So as I said, in my personal opinion, I feel that it is the most important artifact in the exam. And basically what it's doing is you are identifying all the key data entities or objects as part of your solution in the scenario. And if you think about it, the data model has a direct impact on many things. Like, for example, it impacts the license choices, right? For example, customer community user, do they get access to opportunity, right? Then the data model also impacts your sharing, because your sharing solution is sitting on top of your data model. Similarly, data migration, it can only migrate what the objects that you have identified. The whole solution architecture section, which comprises of the business process requirements, again, is related to your data model. Integration, exchange of data, right? Again, reporting, how is data reported? Again, that depends. Your reporting solution will be based upon your data model. Similarly, org strategy, you may or may not need to use a multi-org strategy depending on the amount of data, right? That's a decision you need to make as part of your solution. And so a good data model in general in the CTA should convey the following, and you know this, right? It should have the objects, the different types of relationships, who is owning that particular object, what is the cardinality, is it a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, so on and so forth. Identifying which objects are LDB, as we saw. It should also have a basics of the sharing. That means you need to understand what is the org-wide default for that object for both the internal and external users. And finally, if there's any data which is residing externally, you need to also mention that in the data model. So these are the key things that are covered in the data model. So how I studied for this basically is, as I mentioned, I went back to basics basically, right? So this is like, I went back to, okay, how did I study relational database concepts, right? You start with those entities, the relationships and stuff, just the basic ER modeling. And then again, doing a review of the normalized forms. So if you remember the courses that we took in college or in uni, right? So it's like 1NF, 2NF, 3NF, BCNF, the differences between them. And we don't need to understand really the key differences, but what are the key aspects of each of these normalized forms? Why do we normalize data? And what is the opposite of that, right? Why do we flatten the data structure or the data tables? And what does denormalization help with, right? What use cases does it solve? And also the general understanding of how Salesforce differs from a traditional relational database. And this is usually something that people who are new to Salesforce, they have to grapple with this particular problem, right? Because Salesforce, if you think about it, it's got an interesting sense of normalization. And the best example is the account object, right? So you have different types of addresses like the billing address, shipping address, mailing, and other, right? 4 sets of addresses. But then sometimes your customer will walk out to you and say, maybe we need a custom object which is address and it has to store different records because we need to store data which can basically show rows of addresses. So we may end up using a custom object, or if you're using an industry cloud such as FSC or FSL, they have an address object as part of that package, right? So you need to think of all these different considerations. Then I also did some basic Googling or looking up these traditional data models, and examples are hotel reservation, event management, right? So you don't have to do this in depth, but let's take hotel reservation, for example. Just being able to start thinking about what are the different entities that will be part of this data model at a high level, right? Hotel, for example, has rooms, then you have the customer, and then how do you associate the customer or the person who is booking those rooms? What is that object that will basically relate the rooms? And the room then won't be directly related as well. They could be the room schedule or availability and stuff. So start thinking of what are those objects that are done, and then from there, you work out which Salesforce standard objects can be used and where do I need to customize these objects to solve these things. So similarly, I was just doing some of these things such as hotels, events, vehicle dealerships, and then also thinking of, okay, if I need to solve the data model for Airbnb, again, not at a very detailed level, but very high level, what are the entities I need to solve that particular use case? Again, account contact, having the Airbnb room or the house or the stuff, and then they have an availability. And then how do you then create a reservation, which is like a junction object between your customer and the entity that is put up for the rent or the lease or whatever, right? Okay, so as I mentioned, junction objects, again, they are the ones that will be the missing link between the customer entity and something or a service that they're trying to purchase or procure. So understand how that many-to-many relationship works. In Salesforce, remember that the traditional junction objects are created by two master data relationships, but you could also have one lookup on one side or two lookup relationships. So be aware of these different types of flavors of junction objects. And personally, I felt that because I had spent so much time in the ecosystem, sometimes what happens is we develop blind spots. And what I mean by that is we think that we know a particular topic, but we may not know it as well as we think or we think about it, right? So there were a few topics of that. Like, for example, I had not spent time on the order object or asset object. I had not worked on them, for example, for a long time. And then I had to go back to basics, understand how those objects work and what are the main use cases for using them in my data model. And again, it's a no-brainer, right? You go back and you need to practice all the standard Salesforce data models. And recently, the architect group, the architect relations team, they have uploaded a lot of nice data models. And for example, you have the standard Salesforce, Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, and so on and so forth. So being able to understand those objects and the relationships is very critical, because if someone walks up to you and says, can you draw me the Sales Cloud and Service Cloud data model now? You should be in a position to draw all the key objects and the relationships between them, because those basically form the basis of your data model that you will be preparing for your CTA scenarios as well. And the other thing is, because we have different industry clouds now, like FSC, FSL, health cloud, education cloud, you name it, right? So the thing is reviewing those different data models and understanding some patterns from them. And I'll talk to you about what these patterns mean in the next slide. So let's hold on that. And the other thing was in my developer org, I used to go to Schema Builder, for example, and just drag and drop objects there and just see what the relationships are. And it's interesting what you can find sometimes when doing this. And this helped me a lot. And I should just go back and look at when account, contact, case, work order, opportunity, quote, product, price, book entry, just add all of them and see how are they related internally in Salesforce. And then, keep practicing them. And again, you've seen many other candidates talk about the practice bit, right? So we have to practice everything as part of our preparation, and data model is no different. The most important thing is we need to save time and we need to be accurate as part of our preparation, right? So the practice helps you to basically write down your data model quickly and also develop the muscle memory so that you can gain speed as part of your preparation strategies. Okay, so previously I mentioned about patterns, right? So let me take a quick, let me take a back seat here. So the thing is, I had this particular question about what do you do about things like CPQ and FSL, especially if you don't have experience working with them? How important are they for your CTA preparation? And so the thing that I found out was that, see, if you know CPQ and FSL, it's well and good. It's a different bonus that you know it well, right? But the thing is, even if you don't know them, all we need to know is what are the main use cases they are solving, and how are they helping us to extend the core Salesforce solution, right? What are they bringing to the table? And the thing is, when you have a very small CPQ requirement, suggesting that you use CPQ and mentioning this to your customer, it may be an overkill, right? Sometimes, because it's all about how do you architect this well, and how do you justify this? How do you justify the purchase of CPQ when you're just solving a tiny fraction of a requirement, and CPQ comes with all these different features that it brings? And same thing can be applied to all the other stuff like FSL or education cloud, so on and so forth, right? So that's the thing. How do you find the balance? And that is why what I did was, when I was looking at these different industry cloud data models, I was identifying the patterns to use. And a good example could be the FSL data model. So in the FSL data model, I'm hoping this is visible. I'll have a quick example here. Let's say you have a scenario, and let's say your scenario has assets of the customer, and for some reason they have a maintenance plan on those assets as well, right? So remember, FSL comes with a lot of different features, like all kinds of features are there in FSL. And if you don't have dispatcher requirements, if you don't have requirements to track real-time access of that particular technician who is going to work on the asset and stuff, that FSL requirement, if you blindly position itself and say, I'm going to propose FSL, but you don't have a strong justification for it. So instead, you could basically choose a subset of these objects and see how a Salesforce solved it as part of their data model. And then you could model these objects in your data model as custom objects. So therefore, you don't need the whole FSL. You just need a custom object that behaves as a maintenance plan, right? So if you understand what I'm saying, the requirement should drive you. If you see the requirements have the full-fledged features of the product, then go ahead and confidently you can say that, okay, I'm going to use FSL or CPQ because you have these advanced requirements. But if you have very simple requirements, then maybe you can use a subset of how Salesforce has solved this as part of their standard data models, and use those objects as custom objects as part of your solution. So I guess if there is one key takeaway from my session today, maybe it's this part. And I think when I realized this, right, it was pretty important to me as well. Similarly, in CPQ, you have the product options and features, right? CPQ again comes with advanced features. I'm obviously not an expert in CPQ, but I know that it has pricing rules, product rules, advanced quoting features and stuff, so on and so forth. If those requirements are not part of the scenario, and the scenario just has some advanced bundling concepts, like, we have different options, different features, maybe I can take a subset of the CPQ data model and use custom objects and enhance the product and price book data model with those custom objects and solve that use case. And I can go with the assumption saying that since there are no advanced CPQ requirements, this is my solution. And if I missed anything, the judges obviously will be able to address those gaps. They'll ask me to clarify those gaps in the Q&A. So we can keep things simple and go with this approach. Similarly, I went to all the key clouds like NPSP, Education Cloud, FSC data model, also manufacturing cloud. Consumer goods cloud is important and interesting for me because, again, I haven't worked on this industry cloud, and the fact that it helps you, for example, the thing that I can take away from here is, if you have a store and if you need to track items being sold in the store at an aisle level or a shelf level, how do I do that? What's the data model for that? So that's something I picked up from that. So all of these were in my back pocket, so as to say. So I was like, if I see advanced requirements, I'm going to go with the full-fledged solution. If I see smaller requirements, I'm going to go with a subset of that solution. So that's what I mean by these data model patterns. And these are some things, if you have these patterns in mind, that will help you to solve the scenario faster. And it'll also help you save time as part of your preparation. Okay, so with that being covered, moving on to some of the tips that I had. So the thing is, solving the data model itself requires a specialized, session of its own. But in general, when you're solving the scenario, you're looking for those nouns, you're looking for those entities which are part of the scenario, right? Because they form the basis of a data model. So, whether you use a list to keep track of them, whether you use a rough working copy, see what makes sense for you as you're identifying the objects in the scenario. But the main goal is that you need to create a data model which is optimally sound, which solves the business requirements, and which are accompanied with a relevant justification for all those objects. And more often than not, you will find yourself grappling with these questions as you're solving them. They'll be working in your mind, right? Do I use standard or custom objects? And I know that in Apex Hours, I think Jitendra Zha presented a great session which exhaustively covers this. So look at it. But in general, you need to make these decisions. The addition could be as simple as, do I use products price books, or do I use a custom object to represent this particular entity, right? Those kind of questions. And you need to have, I would say you need to have a working theory with you, right? It's like, if I see this requirement, I'm going to go with product, versus if I see something else and product is, and you don't need pricing and stuff, I will go with a custom object. You need to have these things ready in your toolkit, basically. Similarly, when to use external objects, what kind of relationships they come with. Are your licenses, which you have covered in your licenses slide, are they covering them? And mainly your data model should satisfy all the business process requirements and all the sharing requirements. And as I said, you need to have these patterns ready. For example, if you see there is marketing requirements which are leading into leads, right? That means you need campaign member, and leads. That should quickly be on your data model. Similarly, if you have sales related use cases, then that will be the opportunity lifecycle, quoting, order, and all those objects. And remember that almost every CTA scenario, you will obviously need account, contact, and case at a minimum, right? So you know that these objects are going to be part of your solution. Person account will be very important when it comes to B2C use cases. So always be ready to distinguish how they work and what are the considerations for them. Again, all the key objects will have record types. That's another important consideration that needs to be called out on the data model. For example, accounts could have customer, partner, and contractor, 3 different record types based on your scenario. Again, external objects come with their considerations, so be ready for that. For example, how do you do record level sharing in external objects, right? It's not out of the box. So do you rely on the ESB? Do you do a custom OData adapter? Or do you do a Lightning Web component and you have a without sharing class to actually bring the data and display it to your user? So think about those things and stick with something, and also allow the scenario to guide you. And sometimes if the scenario does not have specific requirements, you can always make assumptions. But when you make assumptions, make sure that you communicate the assumptions back to the judges when you are mentioning when you're mentioning your solution. Okay, so the other thing is when you're doing the data model, I felt that there are clues about these objects in other sections. So for example, if there's a missing object in a data model, when you're looking at the sharing section, it may give you a clue. Okay, you are basically modeling this as a field, but basically the sharing requirement requires you to model it as a custom object. Similarly, the reporting section may give you clues about your data model. Sometimes there may be requirements wherein you need to flatten your data structure to enable performant reporting, and therefore you may have to use a denormalized object to basically get data from different objects and then flatten it out for reporting. The large data volume white paper has a very good use case for this, and so be sure to read that, and that will give you an idea of how this pattern works. So obviously, our goal is that we need to cover as many objects, if not all the objects in our data model. There is a chance to correct this in Q&A, but try not to do that. And also remember that if you end up finding very few objects in your data model when you're solving it, that means the chances are that you're missing some because there could have quite a few objects that are part of these scenarios. Also remember to save time because you're solving for the scope of the requirements. So don't overanalyze stuff. Go with a simple approach, and go with assumptions when there are missing requirements. And the main thing is when you're presenting the data model back, you have to make sure that you are presenting the data model not in isolation, but you have to weave a very compelling story about your data model. That means it should basically project confidence that you understand and you are solving for the end-to-end business requirements as part of a data model, right? So in general, a data model may start maybe with campaigns or with leads, right? So how does the lead get converted to accounts? What happens with the accounts? And then is there a sales cycle? Are there products? Are there any custom objects? Are there external objects? So on and so forth. So the whole thing should basically weave its way into into the story that you are telling as part of that data model. And remember that you have a chance to change the data model in Q&A. That means there's a gap. So there's always a balance between, do you defend your solution with confidence, or do you acknowledge that the judges have identified a gap, and then do you take some time to actually fix that gap, right? So have the balance and don't be afraid to make changes. But if you make changes, remember that sometimes a change may have a cascading effect on other areas. So just be wary of those things as well. Okay, so in terms of data model, I've just put a sample of how I've done my data model. Obviously, there are different flavors to this and the different styles of data models. But basically, I like to keep it very simple, and I keep a very simple legend and a simple way of distinguishing between standard, custom, and external objects. I always go with a default OWD, and usually it is private, right? So, and again, it's very tempting to put private and just say everything is private, but I call out stuff when it is not private. Like instead of putting private everywhere, it's like default is private, and only when it changes on an object am I going to mention it. For example, contact is controlled by parent, and let's say that in my requirement, we need event or some object to be public read only. So why would I make them private and then create some kind of sharing rule when everyone can see it, right? I can just default it to public read only. And this is just an example, and this is just a made up data model that I just randomly put together just to cover all the different types of objects that are seen. The other thing is, I basically, as I said, all the important objects, I am calling out what the record types are. And then I am calling out who the owners are for the important objects. And what do I mean by important objects? Right? The objects that are called out in the security section as well, because for them, you need to understand that security is like a trail. It starts from the person who owns it, and then how is it being shared to other people, and who are those folks who get access to it after that share takes place. And then, there's standard objects, there are custom objects and stuff. And, where there is master detail, I call them out and I understand what is the implication of master detail. That means someone who gets access to the parent, they have access to that. And that again will play a role in my sharing or overall sharing solution. And whenever I use external objects, I will definitely call out what are the different relationships. Remember, there are different relationships: lookup, indirect lookup, external lookup. So being able to explain what those mean as well. Then also you are identifying what the large data volumes are. Some folks I see they do put the number of records as well. I do call that out in the LDV slide that I have. But obviously, if you're comfortable doing that here, you can put those numbers here as well. One of the other key things is, like, let's say there is, I'm using surveys, right? And this can be used for CPQ and stuff. It's not enough to just put a black box and say survey, right? You need to demonstrate that you know a bit more about it. For example, survey has its own data model. But if you draw that data model here, you're going to run out of space eventually. You can't keep doing it. So my technique was I just put a box, just mention survey, and I list all the key objects as part of that. So that way, I'm confidently mentioning that I know what I'm talking about, right? So these are the key objects which are part of surveys. The same technique can be used for knowledge, for CPQ and stuff. Just putting a black box isn't enough these days, in my opinion. I feel that we need to elaborate a little bit and explain what those objects are. And the other tip that I followed, basically, as I said, remember I said, when you explain a data model, it has to be a story, and it basically has to flow from the first part. To remind myself of this, I used to copy the headings of the business process and put them into my data model, because that way, if I forget and I forget to cover something, at least I quickly look back and said, okay, I haven't covered device installation, so therefore I would go to asset, which is device, and then talk about how that is created, who owns it, and any other interesting things, and important things that are part of that solution. So this is my sample, again, a sample data model, and you can choose a style that works for you. Okay, so with that being said, quickly moving on to the next topic, which is data migration. Again, this topic, most of you know exactly what it is, right? So when you think of data migration, as I said, the whole data has a life cycle, and data migration is usually the first step of that life cycle. Like, how is the data coming into Salesforce, and what is it being used for? So my suggestion is that we should have a template and describe the overarching plan of how the migration is going to take place. So the most important things here is obviously identify what are the key objects, what are the volumes you're dealing with, and you're not just working with records, you're working with files and knowledge articles, for example, if they're part of the scenario. So how do they come into Salesforce? And how do you prepare the data prior to load? So is there a need for cleansing, dedupe, and if so, how are you going to achieve it? You should also cover the testing, right? Because you can't directly load data into Salesforce production. That won't end up well. So there's always a testing strategy, and there's a pathway from different sandboxes into production. So how does that happen? Also, when you're doing a go live, is it a big bang or is it an incremental approach? And if you choose one, always mention why. And sometimes the scenario will have a clue as to which approach you need to take. And finally, you need to cover what are the best practices for data migrations that are relevant to your scenario. Then again, the other thing about migration is there will always be some archival, there'll usually be some archival requirements. Don't forget to mention those. And again, here there's a pattern, right? You need to be comfortable with where is this data being archived? What will you suggest as the solution? Will it be EDW, big objects, Heroku, something like Odaseva, or own backup from App Exchange, right? So any of these could be the right answer depending on the scenario and depending on the justification you provide. So have something in the back of your mind and then tailor that based on the scenario. Again, how is this archival process done? What is the frequency of doing the archival process? And then again, how much data should reside on the platform? So for this, usually the reporting requirement will give you a clue. It may say we need 3 years of cases on the platform, but you will determine that cases are anyway LDB. So you need to keep 3 years of cases and multiply that and see what is the amount of data you need to store on the platform. And sometimes there is external data, let's say historical cases, historical invoices. How do you bring that data back into Salesforce if there's a requirement to bring it back, right? Think about those things. And remember that usually in the CTA, especially when I've seen some of these mock CTA scenarios, there is a separate section for data migration. So don't put a blind template which is generalized. Always tie the template back to your requirements in your scenario. And therefore, there could be individual requirements as well. So make sure that you cover or call out those requirements as part of your solution. And finally, the last step is once the migrations happen, do mention 1 or 2 points about how the migration will be validated in production. For example, you could do spot checks on reports and stuff, right? Just mention how you would suggest that to be done. And sometimes governance and other project requirements may have an impact on your migration strategy. For example, there could be a clue here saying we need to do this in a staggered fashion, or we need to do this in one weekend. So then you need to tailor your solution to cater for that requirement. And so as part of that data migration, this is kind of a template I was using. So I made this like a more of a workbook format now for this session. So again, as I mentioned, there could be one or more legacy systems. They could be partial decommissioned or fully decommissioned, and the data is being brought into Salesforce. So I'm identifying what the systems are and what objects are coming from each system, along with the estimated volume and stuff. Then I would recommend that we have the ETL, right? And then be prescriptive about what ETL you would like to propose. And then if there are requirements around things like deduping, enrichment, and cleansing, where is it happening? How is it happening? What's the cycle for that? And then once that's happening, right, we're going through that whole testing cycle. And then we need to say that, okay, there are different sandboxes in Salesforce, like would you use partial copy? Would you use full copy? And then, what percentage of data are you getting, and what are the activities you're doing as part of that migration? At some point, will be ready. Your data migration will be ready to do a full load test into the full copy sandbox. So think about why you need a full copy sandbox in the first place, and what are the activities you'll do as part of this, right? It could be UAT, it could be performance testing, or any other similar activities as part of the load. So once we get confidence that the load is successful, then we will be able to do a full migration into production, right? So that's your go live. Again, the go live, as I mentioned, it can be a one time or it can be a staggered go live. Usually the scenario may also have clues as to what this needs to be. So whatever your solution is, it has to be accompanied with a valid justification. Also, again, I mentioned the archival can be covered in this slide itself to talk about where it's getting archived to, what's getting archived, and what's the frequency of that archival process. The other thing is, what are the different APIs you're using? Usually it's a bulk API, but which version and why? What is the order of the load of the objects, at least the important ones? How do you mitigate locking that happens, right? How do you speed up the process by mitigating any locking that could potentially happen, especially when you're loading parent and child records as part of the same batch of data load? Any other best practices like turning off automation, turning off sharing, deferred sharing calculations. So all of that, you can mention those things as well. And finally, as I mentioned, a note about how do you validate your post migration of, post the data migration, how do you validate data? So this template I feel should cover and all these things. And remember to tie your solution back to the requirements. Okay. So the last section, the last point in data is LDB. I feel that this is the easiest section in data. So all we need to do is identify the LDB objects. The usual suspects are account, case, contacts, maybe, and some of those junction objects like a booking or reservation. They usually end up being the LDB, but obviously let the scenario guide you in this case. You need to do the volume based on the future growth, and usually the scenarios will tell you what that is. So we have to do the math and show and explain how that number came to fruition. The other thing I learned is you have access to Google Sheets as part of your preparation. So you can have templates, because sometimes you get these requirements like saying that we have accounts and there could be 30% growth over the next 5 years. So you can probably have a quick, you can have a template, you put a formula in there and put your number in there, you get a quick response and you can put that there. And that way you can think about what the mitigation should be. So with the mitigations, always be prescriptive. Don't put general answers there, obviously. If it's indexes, try to be specific. Is it standard index or custom index, or are you, creating a new index on this object? And also about making query selective. How would you go about doing that? If it's archival, again, remember the reporting or some other section will give you a clue about how much archival process, when should it take place and how will it take place. And again, skinny tables could be a solution, but again, it's not supported by all objects. There are some considerations that you need to think about. And the other thing for LDV, in my opinion, was just to understand how query optimization happens in Salesforce under the hood database statistics. And there's a link I put here, which basically covers some examples of how this works. Also understanding how the query plan tool will help you in the developer console if you need to do this yourself, and understand what is the cost of the queries that you're running. The LDV white paper, I'm pretty sure most of you have read this. And if you haven't, you need to read this paper again and again. As I said, it has different use cases as well, and some examples of how they could be solved. The SKUs are another key topic, understanding how that will work in terms of LDV and sharing, and how that could possibly create issues in your org. And the other white paper is designing enterprise access at scale. Again, it combines the concepts of security with large data volumes, and it comes with all these different features, right? Parallel sharing rule, recalculation, deferred sharing maintenance, and panel locking. So understanding the differences between these and the use cases of when they would be useful to help us mitigate some of these problems. Okay, so that I think will help us then conclude data. So those are the key things that I want to talk about data. So let's move on to security. So again, we begin by examining what are covered in the exam guide. So as I said, security is a huge domain, but to simplify it, right? So if you think about it, the first thing that the CTA is testing you is on your knowledge of the appropriate platform security mechanisms. And then are you able to design a secure portal architecture? That means secure community access, secure experience site access for both your internal and your external users. Also being able to identify what are the out of the box features that will help you to solve the record level security requirements. And similarly, can you then identify requirements where you need to enhance that solution by using custom Apex, for example? Then the typical standard CRUD using your profiles, and FLS using your profiles, permission set groups. And finally, as I said, SSO, OAuth, all identity stuff that also comes under the security domain. So that itself is a huge topic, but you need to solve that, and all of that will be graded under security as well. Okay, so with those being the topics, let's focus on some of them for today's session. Again, obviously the why is important. So security, right? So I felt that security, as I said, is such an overarching vast topic in the CTA, and like data, it also touches many aspects of the solution, like the system landscape, role hierarchy, the security section itself, the data model, right? So it's everywhere. And so the main things that we need to understand is how are we securing data in the org? This may sound very simple. Trust me, in the CTA, it's not simple at all. Because of the requirements working together, it'll soon start becoming a bit overwhelming. So we need to have a handle and a tab on the different requirements, and we need to solve it methodically as part of our solution. So again, it's all about CRUD, FSL, sorry, I keep saying FSL, FLS, and then you have record level security as well. And then how do you secure data in transit? See, the thing is, the security for integration is covered under the integration domain, but that's where there's a bit of a crossover between security and integrations. Understanding, how the two SSL can be done for inbound versus outbound. And then when you have specific use cases where you may have payments being done, you may probably see that the scenario has an existing payment gateway, or you need to write something custom, or maybe you need to mention how are you going to comply with PII requirements. So think about all these different aspects. Apart from securing data in the org, you also need to secure data when it's at rest, right? So that's all about encryption. So at a high level, you have options between classic and shield platform encryption. So understanding use cases, differences, different flavors, and what are the things that shield platform encryption can protect. So for example, it can protect your Tableau, CRM data sets. It can protect the message bus in platform. So understanding the whole gamut of those different options that it can help you with. So IDAM, I'll come. There's a special slide for this. Obviously, it's super important. We'll come back to that. And the last bit about security is also monitoring. Don't forget this. As part of Shield, for example, we have real-time event monitoring. So understanding what is being monitored, what are the use cases, how can we consume that data, and also enhanced transaction policies, which is more of a refined version of the previous solution, which comes with a condition builder, which comes with different ways of helping us to track different transactions and then take some actions based on those transactions. Okay, so with that, let's talk about how we secure data in Salesforce. So the thing is, when you are solving the solution, the main thing is to keep track of who is owning this object and who is it being shared with. So as I said, in the data model, you are starting off with the owner and the OWD. So then you need to keep track of the requirements where it says, okay, for example, this sales rep is owning this opportunity. It needs to be shared with another role. So how is that being done? So that's why we need to be well versed in all the basic declarative Salesforce sharing features. And this could be starting from your OWD, starting from role hierarchy. And I'm not going to touch on the role hierarchy here, but you have a separate artifact for role hierarchy. It is usually very simple, but the thing is, when you are presenting your solution, which could have sharing rules, which could be ownership based or criteria based, sharing rules, public groups, whatever your solutions, right? They should, if they have the role hierarchy, they should match it. And this is something that I had trouble with initially. Sometimes my solutions here used to be out of sync with my role hierarchy. So you see some of the mocks, right, that you're seeing candidates basically when they're explaining security requirements, they go back to the role hierarchy and they're explaining that. So that way the solution is more clearer in the minds of the judges. Remember that all these things should work together, and remember that these solutions should scale. So that means don't be putting a lot of criteria based sharing rules because there are some limits around them, right? That's an example. So make sure that your solution is scaling and performant as well. The other thing I realize is that the community access is very critical for the CTA scenarios. And how do you give access to partners, customers, or any other external folks? So mainly understanding how sharing sets work, groups, what are the different types of licenses, and what are the implications of each type of license, right? You have your base customer community versus customer community plus. What are the differences there? And then again, customers more often than not, they work with cases. That means they raise service requests. So the case has ownership starting from the customer who raised it. Then there's probably some routing happening. So just imagine how is the life cycle of the case going on and who is owning the case at different stages in its life cycle. Also, there are things like delegated external admin or super user, right? So how would you set this up? What are some of the features that come with this? So you need to know these things very clearly. Again, all the features, you need to know them. So there are some things we miss sometimes, which are implicit sharing. Remember, it can also be used to solve a particular use case. Master detail relationship, as I mentioned, the child is controlled by the parent. You also have things like manual sharing and also teams. And also a fairly newer thing, which is account data relationship rules. Now, this doesn't cover every aspect of sharing, but these are the main critical things that we need to really know in and out and see how they all work together. Now, all of this is simple and well and good, but remember that you cannot ignore Apex sharing. So some use cases may come where Apex sharing is the better solution, and it can scale and be performant as well. And also remember that for this, you need to understand the whole thing, right? What are the share tables? How are you creating that share record? And what is required as a high level? What is the information required to create a share record? And how will that share record be deleted later on? What are those things that will work, right? So just know that as well. And don't be afraid of pitching Apex or programmatic sharing if the requirement asks for it. And the other thing is, make sure that you practice how you solve these requirements, because sometimes I see candidates, they write ownership based sharing rule everywhere. They call out the default OWD for every requirement, but you can basically default some of the OWD and say, okay, before I mention sharing, you can tell the judges that your OWD is private, and you need to assume that unless I call it out otherwise for a different requirement. and also use maybe acronyms and stuff, shorten the time. But when you present it back to the judge, make sure that you're explaining it in a very logical and understandable manner. Again, do not duplicate answers. That's another time waster, in my opinion. For example, your security requirements may have some SSO requirements, right? You may have a separate slide which covers IDAM. So just mention that. But in the slide, be sure to call out the actual bullet point requirement of this particular section so that way you can tie it back to the requirements. Okay, so some things generally I felt about security. These may seem very innocent or very easy, right? But the thing is, it sometimes really gets hard, and you may have seen this if you have solved some scenarios, right? You always need to be on top of, how is the customer data created, who owns them at that point, and how is that being shared with other users. Being able to think through this will start making you aware of all the different options, and then you will be able to choose the option that works for that particular requirement. Similarly, partners, right? So how do partners get access to all the different kinds of customer data, including accounts, cases, opportunities, or any other custom objects? How does that work? Then, for example, how does any record, how do you share records between two or different partners or two different external users? How do you do that? And then there could be use cases where you need to give and take temporary access to a record, right? So think of how can you solve those use cases. Some interesting things is objects like contact and quote. What is the OWD of them? What are the options? If you enable person account, then what happens to the contacts OWD? What are the options then available? You just have a quick view of these things and make sure you remember and can explain these things better. The other thing about us as Salesforce architects is Salesforce obviously has these 3 releases and a lot of new features keep coming, right? One of the interesting things I saw is all this time you've been taught that the Salesforce security is an inverted pyramid. That means you have your OWD at the bottom of the pyramid. That means it is the most restrictive setting. And then you use other Salesforce sharing mechanisms to open up security to people who need it. But now you have restriction rules, and this has become generally available, right? So I'm not saying that this will probably come in a CTA scenario, but because it's generally available, it's fair game, and therefore do be wary of these things. Like, make sure you understand these things. Maybe there could be a requirement, who knows, that could be solved by these newer features. Similarly, products, previously the sharing was controlled by the price book, but looks like products now have their own OWD as well, or at least rather it's coming in the forthcoming release. Also, Salesforce has this thing called threat detection now, which can protect against things like credential stuffing or session hijacking, right? So how does that work? So just have a quick, be mindful of all these newer features that Salesforce has. Okay, so IDAM, obviously, let's go there. As I said, it's a very vast topic, and it probably requires its own session as well. So, but what are some of the key things that I learned, right? And that's why I want to talk about this. First of all, when you are proposing a single sign-on solution as part of your solution that you're presenting, the scenario may have an IDP already for you. It may have an identity provider, or you may have to propose one. And then obviously you have to say why, right? So some of the key identity providers could be Azure AD, ADFS, Ping, Okta, right? Ping and Okta are these agnostic IDPs that are available. So having a point of view on each and understanding when to use each is pretty important. And there could be some, and as I said, any of these could be a right answer depending on the scenario requirements and depending on the justifications you use. Remember that Salesforce will usually be the service provider, right? But Salesforce can be an IDP, it can be a service provider, and it can also be both. So think of these use cases where Salesforce will be an IDP and SP. Think of what are those use cases that you do and how will you configure Salesforce to behave as both of them. My domain is an important topic. Again, it's a prerequisite for some of the SSO use cases. So know what it is, how is it set up, considerations, so on and so forth. All the different types of SSO, federated, SAML, and even delegated authentication, right? What are some of the features that it brings to the table? Obviously, all the different SSO flows are important. And when you're explaining SSO flow, make sure that you are able to explain the context of your scenario. And what I mean by that is, instead of saying IDP or SP, you can say Salesforce is, let's say Salesforce is SP, and let's say Okta is the IDP, say Salesforce Okta, and establish that and use that and make it relevant to your particular scenario. And the other thing that I recommend is to have hands-on practice with some of these IDPs. The way you would set up a AD group, and then set up that to then communicate with Salesforce. How does provisioning and deprovisioning work? So all these things, just make sure you have some hands-on practice. So the visualizing that will help you overcome limitations of not knowing IDAM, if that is your experience. Obviously, I did have some experience with IDAM throughout my career, but I felt that doing some hands-on practice, being aware of the different options, helped me to understand these things better. The other thing I realized was Canvas is an older tech that Salesforce has, but it's still relevant. You may have a use case where a web-based interface has to be integrated within Salesforce, where users have to should not leave Salesforce and access it. So how do you maintain the context and the authentication, right? So there are some flows like sign request flow, OAuth flow. So understand how those things are set up and how does it work. Similarly, you may also have a social sign-on use case. People may have to use their Facebook, LinkedIn, or social network credentials. So how is that set up, right? So it's a pretty easy thing, but don't miss explaining, things like the auth provider, reg handler. How does the registration handler work? What are the use cases, and what do you need to configure in the experience site to support this? The other topic is obviously authorization, and mainly this is about how Salesforce supports OAuth. So as I said, in 2017, I did a presentation on OAuth, but that basically covers just the basics of OAuth and some basic flows. Obviously, when you are when you are a CTA candidate, you're expected to know more of it. And most of you have already done the identity and access management badge that talks about all these concepts. The most important thing in OAuth in Salesforce is the connected app. So you need to be able to explain what's a connected app, what does it do, and when you go to a connected app in Salesforce, you need to be able to understand all the different options and attributes that connected app has. And again, what are the different flows that Salesforce supports? There's so many different flows, and what are the key entities that are exchanged? And pay special attention to the different tokens. For example, does the jot bearer flow return the refresh token? So have a view on those things and see, what works and what tokens are returned by these different flows. Also remember that connected apps have a section to enable SAML. So be aware of this, and also try to understand what use case is this solving and why do you need this part of it. And remember that SSO and OAuth, they work together as well. So you will have these nested flows. For example, you can have a mobile application which will have an OAuth, and then it will start a SSO which could use SAML or OpenID Connect. So see how that whole thing works together. So basically, I use this link, which was Cloud Sundial, and it's by Lawrence Newcomb. So thanks a lot to him. I really liked his, the flows that he had for SSO as well as OAuth. So I used them and I practiced them a lot. And you need to be ready. So in the CTA to either draw or to explain these flows, and to make sure that you personalize these flows to your scenario. So I think those are the main things I want to talk about in IDAM. And again, for IDAM, I had a very simple template. Obviously, you can come up with yours, but this is what I had. So again, I would basically represent all the different identity stores. Usually you have Active Directory and or LDAP. Choose an IDP, choose one, be prescriptive about it. How does it communicate with Salesforce? And then what are the key steps for setting up SSO? For example, if you have SP initiated SSO, you need my domain. Then you need to establish trust by exchanging certificates and setting up all the required prerequisites in the Salesforce single sign-on settings. Then you also need to configure your login page, right? Mention all those steps here so that you clearly call them out. And then if there's provisioning, deprovisioning requirements, how are they being done, right? Are you using SAML JIT for provisioning? Are you using API for deprovisioning? And just be ready with those answers as well. There could be some things where people are natively authenticating into Salesforce. Do call it out as well. If you have a social sign-on, as I mentioned, do call out the steps for social sign-on. As I mentioned, auth provider, reg handler, experience site configuration. If the ESB and ETL, how are they communicating, right? So which OAuth flow is being used? Usually it is dot bearer, or you may also end up using web server. Choose one and obviously justify the answer. If you have mobile access or any other access, talk about the flows. And as I mentioned, this is usually a nested flow, combining OAuth with one of your SSO flows. You may also have a requirement where you're using Canvas. So mention that, and also mention how is the Canvas authentication working. So mentioning all of that and then tying them back to the individual SSO requirements will basically help you explain all the IDAM requirements in one slide. And obviously you can come up with your template as well, if that makes sense to you. Okay, so with that, I suppose just some last things about security. See, the thing is, you have this security trail mix, right, which covers the whole length and breadth of security. It's a very vast trail mix, and we also have the certification for it. The other key resource we have is the Salesforce Security Guide. I felt that this resource, I ended up reading it twice or thrice, and it has very good exhaustive coverage of all the key Salesforce security features. So you need to really know most of the topics in this guide. But in general, some of the other topics I focused on in addition to all the other stuff we spoke about is all these things, right? So as you know, Salesforce is going to enforce MFA in its product starting next month. So you need to understand what are the options to set up MFA in Salesforce, and then other things like cryptography basics, like symmetric algorithms, asymmetric algorithms. How do they work? Just have a basic understanding of these things. Things like login flows, things like what are the Salesforce features that help you to do a quick health check. Be very aware of them and also the options that they have. There are different vulnerabilities that we could have in Salesforce, like cross-site scripting or sockle injection, right? So how do you protect against those kind of vulnerabilities? We already spoke about Shield, right? So the main thing again is understanding what is the use case that Shield will help you to solve. What is the difference between, for example, probabilistic and deterministic encryption, and when will you use each, right? And also, how do you monitor some of the things like logins and the setup audit trail? Again, when it comes to code, basic stuff, just know how do you write secure code, especially things like with sharing, without sharing. How do you enforce record level sharing as part of your code when the code is being executed as part of the overall transaction context? Again, in Apex, you have crypto functions. So do read about some of the high level crypto functions and what use cases they solve. You can protect some data by keeping them in protected custom settings and custom metadata. So don't ignore that. There is another white paper that talks about how record sharing works in depth. So make sure that you read that white paper a lot. I used to read this on the days closing up to my exam, just to get a quick overview of how everything works in Salesforce as part of sharing and visibility. And because sharing is such a vast topic, there's so many simple things you need to remember. I used flashcards, as most of you are doing and have done. I use Anki personally, so that helped me to cover and revise a lot of these different security topics. And I also realized, again, no brainer, you need to practice hands-on these security features, especially things around, which you're not using as part of a day-to-day duties. Do learn them and try and do as much as you can in your Trailhead playground or in your dev sandboxes. So I guess that covers what I had to talk about these two topics, that is data and security. So just some final thoughts. As I mentioned, the good part about Salesforce that I like personally is that most of the study material is available online. Obviously, there are some specialized things that you can do, but for the most part, all the data is democratized. So mainly I used all the help articles. I used Tailhead for hands-on practice. I looked at all the different white papers. As I mentioned in my previous slides, I called those white papers out where necessary. And the other thing I missed out was this sharing architecture white paper as well. The new Salesforce Architect blog and sites, make sure you keep looking at them. I keep seeing some great content being added, and a lot of it is very relevant to data and security. As I mentioned, the latest data models that have been published are pretty awesome and valuable in my opinion. We have all the CTA mock scenarios, right? When you're ready to practice, you have to use the mock scenarios and rely on them heavily. I know that a lot of friends in the ecosystem have their own mocks now, so there are a lot of mocks coming out. So that's awesome. uh, keep looking at the exam guide from time to time. That is something else that you need to really understand. It seems like it's very obvious, right? But looking at it again will start giving that perspective of what is important and what needs to be covered. And for me personally, apart from all of this, I used to do a lot of I used to look at a lot of videos, especially mocks and stuff, which were hosted on ApexR. So really thankful to this channel, and also for stuff that Johan had uploaded on his channel as well. So all these things helped me, and I recommend these to anyone who's looking at this. The other resources I used, I won't cover too much time on it, but obviously many of you are aware of this book, right? Becoming a Salesforce Certified Technical Architect. One of the things that I like personally about this book is, especially for data and security, the coverage is very exhaustive. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of coverage of the basics, the agnostic basics, like cryptography or the relational database concepts. So that was a good summary in this book as well. The other book that I did brief review of was Ultra Learning. I feel that in the hands of a right CTI candidate, this book will be very valuable. I could not get the full value. I got some value, like for example, understanding how a software like Anki can help you by spaced repetition and things. But a lot of principles here, which will basically help you to study fast and learn a lot of content in a short period of time. So if you have the time and if you get this copy of this book, do spend some time on it if you are inclined to do so. And generally, I won't talk about this too much, but the main thing is the psychological aspect of your preparation. One needs to be positive, especially when you are seeing hurdles in your preparation. It doesn't mean that we need to back down. It means that we need to try and overcome those hurdles and stuff. So for that, we need to be positive. This is one book that I liked. I would definitely recommend that you find something that works for you and then work on that aspect as well, because that is something that people do ignore. And I feel that being positive, being mentally strong is very important, and it should be, and it'll help you to study for your CTA and prepare in a better fashion. In general, I won't talk too much about this topic as well, but one of the problems I faced was, the CTA scenario. As you know, it's a huge scenario. It could also be something that is very alien to us in terms of the domain or the vertical, right? So the thing is, speed reading was something that I started actively practicing. That means reading anything that I can get my hands on when I'm not studying in my free time, right? That basically was helping me to practice reading, because the faster you can read, the faster you can comprehend, and the faster you can solve by keeping accuracy in mind. I think that is the most important thing, as part of your preparation for the CTA. And just to summarize what I spoke about, as I said, these two topics are important. Like every section is important, but I feel that if data and security, if you can get those right, then you have given yourself a very strong chance of doing very well in your CTA board. And that's why I would say that, prioritize your preparation strategies. If I would go back to November of 2020, just the months before that, in my first attempt, I would definitely, focus heavily on data and security, and make sure that if there are any blind spots, if there are any assumptions I had, I would basically clear them out. And if any of you have not studied for the domain certs yet, I would say, please don't do it only for the passing score, right? For example, you can pass a domain certification without maybe ignoring one or two topics, because the passing score could be 70% stuff. Because the more you learn and the more length and breadth you cover of the topic in your certification preparation, that will help you save time during your CTA prep, and you don't have to go back and study them again. And as I mentioned, getting these sections correctly, because think of the CTA scenario as a puzzle, and all these different aspects will basically slot, and they'll fall in place if you have data and security correct. And I feel that that was my experience, and I felt that whenever I had a scenario where I'm getting the data model correct, or I have a good feeling about it, that I've done reasonable coverage of the data model, those attempts were better off for me. So just make sure that you focus on it, not just in your presentation, when you're presenting it back to judges, but also when you're preparing for the data model. And again, as I said, keep it simple. Don't overanalyze the requirements, and always remember to justify your choices when you're making choices. And when there are missing requirements, or when you don't think there are clear-cut requirements, make assumptions. They are your best friend, and make sure that you communicate these assumptions back to the judges. So that way, if you make a wrong assumption or if you miss something, the judges can then give you an opportunity to clarify that in the Q&A section. The main thing is, when you're preparing, make sure that you relax as well and have fun. And data and security. When I was preparing for my retake, I was actually very intrigued and happy that I'm learning them from the ground up, and it was very interesting and exciting for me to do that. So I hope you can look at it at the same way, instead of being worried or tensed about that preparation. And so I think, thank you all for bearing with me for the last approximately 1 hour, I guess, talking about these topics. And I wish you, all of you, the very best for your journey to CTA. And as Amit said at the start, I also wish you a lot of success this year. I think we've been through a lot of stuff to the last year, and I really hope that this year brings a lot of success to all of us. So I guess with that, I'll probably end my presentation. And once again, I really thank you all for giving me an opportunity to share these things with you. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Calvin. It's a really great presentation and lots of aspect you touch in your presentation. So anybody have any question, feel free to put into the chat window or I will be allow you to unmute. So raise your hand. So accordingly, I will allow to unmute and you can ask a question directly. So there is one question. What are the some good resources to learn more about data migration?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So data migration, if I'm not mistaken, there are resources on Trailhead that talk about what are the general aspects of data migration. But as I mentioned in my slide as well, some of the things are dispersed across. So as long as you are able to choose a template to talk about data migration and then explain all those things that I mentioned, right? The objects, the volumes, what are some of the best practice mitigations, what is the plan that you're proposing. I think that will go a long way in basically explaining data migration. So I think Trailhead and some of your Salesforce help resources should be your first point of contact. And the other resource I would mention are all the mocks that have been uploaded in especially in Apex Hours, right? So in all those mocks, what I saw was different candidates had their own flair, their own flavor of those different templates. And then I guess I basically took bits and pieces of those things and then put them as part of my slides. So I think that's one place to start off learning about data migration.
So another question, Calvin, do you have your own blog or any other way to learn more from your experience? People like your presentation, want to learn
Yep.
more from you.
Yeah, so I guess yeah, it's been a while. I've been postponing explaining more about my experience, and I definitely I do have a blog, but I haven't blogged since I joined Salesforce. But I think I will definitely blog more and be active, and that's hopefully one of my plans and for the new year. And hope I stick to it. And if definitely, I'm open to any questions on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I can definitely help if there are any specific questions that folks have.
So, so one more great question. What are the some good resources to understand Salesforce license and
Yeah.
what each cover from DM perspective?
Okay, so I'm assuming DM here is data model. Again, for licenses, again, the stock standard Salesforce helps a lot. I know there's one link if you search especially for your community licenses, because again, there are some very subtle differences between the different licenses, and you need to understand, for example, what objects do they have, what features do they have. For example, your customer community does not have access to sharing rules, does not have access to some other things, right? So understanding those things, again, you would go with your uh, Salesforce help and with Trailhead. I guess those would cover
This
all
is
the licenses.
this is really great topic, Salesforce license. I will be see if anyone we can do another session in this in Apex Hour for this. I will be check Kelvin if you are available or someone else available, but we'll try to do a big session on this topic because this is really
Yep,
important from the exam point of view. I will try my best to
absolutely.
arrange one session on this topic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And these questions are created because again, as I said, when you are doing these things, you're basically putting all of these things together from different sources. And I think, yeah, that will be a great topic, licenses. And even the other question about data migration, right? As I mentioned, we have all these things, but maybe we need one more resource that basically can explain that better. And if that doesn't exist, maybe one of us should create one such resource. And I'll see if I can probably do that.
Yep. And we will try to share this presentation on Apex our website and top of it lots of link, whatever the links are there, I will share all of them into the Apex our website. And regarding that one point to identity, talk about Lawrence have a really great flow diagrams.
Yep.
And we also have recording from the Lawrence on Apex our YouTube channel. If you want to learn about that, we have a dedicated playlist for identity and we cover all of the topic by some demos and by some CT experts to cover it into a different way. And if you like to read the blog, go ahead and read the blog, or if you want to listen it or watch it, then you can watch all of the flow explanation on ApexR website or YouTube. Okay, with that said, I can see there's no more questions. Last question. Any additional thought on SF enforcing removing view all updating permission for guest user?
If I understand this question correctly, Sachin, you're talking about the new guest sharing rules, right? So yes, so maybe I didn't cover this clearly, right? So if that's what you're referring to, in sharing rules now, because of that change happened that Salesforce made, that was mainly to make sure that we are protecting our data against unauthorized view by guest users. And therefore, if guest users need access, we need to explicitly create these guest user sharing rules. So now when you create a new sharing rule, there's a third bullet point option. Initially, it used to be just ownership based, criteria based, but now you have these guest sharing rules as well. And basically, you raised a good point. When you talk about external users, guests is something that's overlooked. And your scenario may have some requirements for guest users as well. So we need to think about that, right? So will you use Apex without sharing, or will you use this the way that it's meant to be? You basically have private sharing, and then you will open up access to your guest for that particular object using the guest sharing rules, and you basically put the criteria there. So that would be the way to do that. And I guess that would basically solve the problem of basically allowing your guests to access your data. I hope